get rolling.
Yeah, sure.
Sweet. Well, Neil, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Making the trip across. Where'd you come in from?
I came in from Seattle.
Okay, cool. How's the trip been so far?
Nonstop and easy.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Yeah. So you came in Friday, spent the weekend over here in Fort Myers, or
the beautiful Gulf Coast of Florida. Yeah.
Cool. So I think we got a couple different things that we wanted to talk about and touch on today. But maybe you could start by just giving us a little bit of a background into who you are, and then maybe we can get into your business, YonderWest, and what you guys do. So
sure.
Maybe take it from the top. How did you get started in aviation?
So much like one of your previous guests, Ryan, over at Satcom, my first job in aviation was at Independence Air.
Okay, interesting.
So, yeah, I came from the airlines. I got my dispatcher license in 2013 at Jepson. So I've been in the scheduling world for quite some time now.
Okay.
But I grew up in New Hampshire. I was fascinated by route structure for the airlines, mostly revenue management. I was at the airlines for about 7.5 years, okay. And then made the transition over to private aviation.
Okay.
That being said, because of the way that the airlines worked, I bounced around a bunch. So I started in my hometown of Manchester, New Hampshire, went down to Boston Logan, went out to San Jose, California, came back to New Hampshire, back to California, back to New Hampshire, back to Florida, back to Connecticut. Yeah, so
moved around quite a bit.
Yeah, I'm pretty. To this day, I'm still pretty cross jurisdictional.
Okay, cool. You said that you spend. What time of year you spend up in the Northwest?
So I typically, summers in the Pacific Northwest are absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah.
So I would recommend it year round.
Yep.
But I currently divide my time between California and Washington State.
Okay.
I spend the winters just outside Vancouver, British Columbia.
Okay.
And then I am a little bit of a nomad for the summer.
Okay.
Because thankfully, we'll get into it, but my business allows me to be remote.
Yeah.
Because to the average customer, the experience is exactly the same whether I'm sitting at a resort in Cabo San Lucas or at my parents' house in New Hampshire or at a house in California or at my house in Washington. It's really irrelevant to them because they get the exact same level of service because they don't have to knock on the door of the hangar and say, hey, are you in there? What's going on?
Yeah, sure.
Because all I need is a cell phone, right?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So, and you said that you also do some camping as well. What type of setup do you have for that?
So it's actually kind of funny. I tend to lose my driver's license physically every 4 months.
Okay.
And every single time, every time I lose it and have to request a new one, it is an opportunity for them to not give it back to me. But somehow they do. They mess that up. Somewhere at DMV, they're like, we should not be doing this, but here, we're doing it again. So I drive a 2016 Toyota Tacoma Limited,
okay.
With a version 2 Go Fast camper
okay.
that I lovingly describe as my baby because it took 9 months to get in the middle of the pandemic.
Yeah.
So I waited for it for quite some time.
Sweet.
Yeah.
I was going, we didn't talk about that before, but if I was going to make a guess, I was going to say Toyota Tacoma.
I'm a Tacoma bro. That's okay. I have some friends that drive Raptors and they definitely pay a Raptor tax.
Yeah.
So, we have a little bit of back and forth on that.
Yeah.
It's all good.
So you've been in on the private side of aviation for a few years now.
Close to a decade.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about what that experience is like, and then that transition that you made into starting up your own company.
Sure. So I started at a private FBO in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I tend to be a little disagreeable, so sometimes things don't work out.
Okay.
But ironically, so while I was there, my next job was actually buying their first 3 airplanes for a startup in Los Angeles at the exact same time that I was working on an FBO 500 yards down the field. So there's a lot of, things kind of all come around at the end of the day because it's a small world and it's a small industry. So after I left in Portsmouth, I went and got my dispatch license at Jepson in 2013, and then started at I was the first scheduler at Surf Air in Los Angeles.
Cool.
I was hired. I was hired 9 days before the start of Part 135 Ops for them, and I was there for the original for the first year basically of operations. And of course, now there's been some changes to their business model, of course, because that's how things work. But at the time, it was actually an aircraft operation, and it was one of the most insane, gratifying experiences of my life, mostly because it was like you were building something from literally nothing. Right.
That's awesome.
And trying to figure out exactly how to make it work. I didn't get involved with a lot of like the passenger side of things, but from an ops standpoint, like it was really just a blank slate, right? You had to kind of build it up from, there was an outline, but then you had to figure out exactly how to make that work in the terms of at the time it was a true startup, limited resources.
Yeah.
A great team of founders. Wade Irely is still, one of my biggest mentors. And he's been around the block with a couple different aviation startups, and now he's doing some amazing work in the in the student insurance space, education insurance. Out in Connecticut. So an amazing founder group, but startups have ebbs and flows.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Sure. What was that process like of being in on the ground floor and getting that operation up and going?
I mean, I found it to be particularly validating, but I think I don't think that there's necessarily a uniform set of expectations when it comes to startups, especially for actual operation startups.
Sure.
Because some folks have problems with funding, some folks have problems with pilots, some people have problems with maintenance. Surf Air was super lucky because we had a great set of people that kind of came in to set it up, and it's a little bit of a small world because now I also do consulting for a company that helped them start up, and it was one of those things where you make friends at one point and eventually it turns into something else.
Sure.
So, but I found it to be super validating. I still have some of my really really good friends from Los Angeles in the Surf Air days are still some of my best friends today.
Cool.
So it was important, and it made there were a lot of compatriots that from the Los Angeles area, and it was certainly an interesting experience. The original founding group were primarily LDS. They were primarily Latter-day Saints, and it was to the point where we actually had to convince them that you have to have coffee on the planes. No one's going to want to fly in a Pilatus for an hour up to San Francisco if you don't have coffee on the plane. So, but yeah, it was those kind of like little challenges. But as it turned out, it was a great stepping stone for me. I'd lived in California previously. It was great for me to get back, and it was a super super easy decision to make.
Sure.
And it kept me on the West Coast for a good solid 5 years. And I've been bi-coastal between being back in New Hampshire and being back in California and Seattle and bouncing around.
Cool. So. And so following Surf Air, where'd you go from there?
I went up to ACI Jet in San Luis Obispo, and I'll be forever grateful to Bill Borgsmiller for bringing me up there and flying us around and making me fall in love with the Central Coast of California.
Nice.
Some of the folks that work there are incredibly well-meaning, and it's very validating to get a fresh perspective on aircraft charter. Not one that I necessarily agree with, but that's a different discussion. So again, that's kind of one of those things where I've had a lot of people in the last decade tell me, "Oh, you need to stay in your lane." A lot of them don't know what my lane is, so it's not that I have a problem swaying in and out of my lane, but it's more just that there's a preconceived set of notions, and it's up to me to kind of bust those up a little bit.
Sure.
So
okay, yeah. And so following ACI, where do you go from there?
I took a break.
Okay.
I worked in the wine industry for a little bit, and on the Central Coast.
Okay.
Did a lot of interviews. Met one of my biggest mentors, who now runs the flight department in Michigan. I ran around a little bit and eventually found my way back here to Florida. Actually,
Okay.
I was at Satcom for a minute.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what were you doing there? Scheduling,
I
dispatch?
was their flight support coordinator, which
Okay.
is at the time it was a poorly defined it was a poorly defined job description. In fact, when I was leaving, they were like, you're not our scheduler, right? And I'm like, well, yeah, clearly. But you never actually told me that. But I kind of figured it out.
Yeah.
So yeah.
All right. And so tell me, how did you come about in starting YonderWest? Well,
So I had moved back and forth a few times between California and Florida and Connecticut, and I was at Gama Aviation, which was at the time the exclusive partner for Wheels Up, and now of course they're owned by Wheels Up.
Yeah.
And they basically brought me in to be one of 4 people on staff to basically handle managed operations. So there would be one person doing a 12-hour shift, and you would have a group of 8 to 12 schedulers, logistics folks, dispatchers that were all kind of focused on the Wheels Up fleet. You would just have me, and when I swapped out with someone else, they would bring in someone else. But basically, the managed side of the house was completely alien to a lot of my friends that work there, and
Sure.
and have some have left and some are still there.
Yep.
And I all the power in the world to them, because they're fighting the good fight, but it's certainly an uphill battle. And I wasn't necessarily super thrilled about it, and I just decided that I could do it better. And so for the first, I was fine for the first 9 months working there, and then the last 9 months it was basically just me trying to get fired, and it's clearly impossible is what I'll say. But I soft launched the business in Palm Springs, California, to a relatively positive crowd while I was still at Gamma.
Okay.
And then on New Year's Day, I gave them 30 days notice, way more than they needed. And they said, well, why we really like you. Why can't you just stay? I'm like, that ship sailed. So I kind of soft launched the business, and a lot of it, unfortunately, I hate to say it, but it was out of desperation, right? If not now, when? And I didn't know what that time span was going to look like. So I figured, well, I might as well do it right now.
Okay. Okay.
But yeah, so I started the business in January of 2018. So coming up, depending on when this podcast comes out.
Yeah, sure.
Just about 4 years.
Yep.
It's been one of those things where I'm a very reluctant entrepreneur. I'm a scheduler. I'm an ops guy by nature and by trade. So owning a small business is fun and exciting and bone-crushingly terrifying, frequently all at the exact same time. So I am perpetually challenged and at the same time horrified.
Okay. So tell me exactly what do you do? I know that you work with Part 91 flight departments. What's the I guess what are the services that you're delivering to them? What's the benefit that they're receiving from you?
Sure. So we have 2 main lines of business. I have a partner in Los Angeles named Greg Andrews, and he and I are 2 peas in the exact same pod.
Okay.
He's been in aircraft management for 35 years. He took a little bit of a break. We're trying to get him back into the real world here. But he half jokingly describes me as the scheduler he's been waiting for 40 years. We have 2 main lines of business. The first of which is kind of my side of the house, which is contract dispatch and scheduling. So we do Part 91 logistics, international trip support, ground handling, pretty much anything that you would expect a standard corporate scheduler to do. We do it on a remote basis, and a vast majority of my work is retainer. Okay. So we're not. It's not really like a contract flight attendant or a contract pilot where you're counting how many days you're using them. You're airlining them from home to wherever the airplane is. You're figuring out how that works, and you bill it out at the end.
Sure.
I charge a flat monthly fee. My clients have the ability to call me 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with the exception of New Year's week because I have my own personal travel.
Okay.
one week a year. But they have unlimited access to use me. They don't have to worry about if we need them for an extra week, is that going to be a problem? The answer is always no.
Sure.
Because they're already paying for that flexibility.
Sure.
And as a result of that, I'm kind of alleviating them from a lot of the pressure points, both from a staffing perspective. So if you have a scheduler who's overworked or has just way too much on their plate, and they need to jettison some of the excess stuff, they have a person to fall back on, all with implementation of me and my team of dispatchers being able to kind of fill in that gap in a matter of hours rather than going through a full onboarding process. And you have to figure out and teach all this stuff. Like we can literally implement the entire portion in a matter of hours.
Okay.
And a vast majority of that is because if you're a traditional flight department or if you're an aircraft management company, the owner of an aircraft comes to you and you say, okay, well, this is my box, right? And they build a box and they figure out a way to put all of those services that they can provide for you into that box. Mm-hmm. I do the exact opposite. So instead of having a predetermined and predestined box, I actually create a box for an individual client or for an individual aircraft.
Sure.
So you can have, sister ships, right? You can have serial numbers 1 and 2 of a Falcon 900. They may have completely separate needs. They may have completely separate mission profiles.
Yeah.
They may be operated completely differently. And as a result, I don't have to build a box that accommodates both of them. I just build 2 boxes, one for each. So it's more of, I call it an evolved offering, but really it's a parsed down offering because the box that other people would have to put them in doesn't really move with them.
Sure.
Whereas my box is perfectly made for what they need.
Sure.
So they can have the ability to use certain sets of my services without needing the entire thing. Mm-hmm. And that is, of course, price dependent. What they need, what flight departments will need out of me is entirely dependent on exactly what kind of infrastructure I need to build for them.
Sure.
Rather than setting up a whole set of infrastructure and then needing a flight department to come in to pay those to pay that to pay that insurance fee and to manage a fuel program and to do all this stuff, right? This is all stuff that most flight departments do on their own anyways. So all I'm doing is not only administering that in the services that they already have, but I'm complementing their existing relationships with their pilots, with their insurance brokers, with their aviation attorneys, with their with all the contract fuel programs that they might have. All that stuff that they already have, I am there to help support the growth of that organization rather than forcing them into a set of services that they don't necessarily need.
Sure. So, and over the last couple of years, especially in the last 2 years, have been quite a few changes in the industry and the workforce and technology. And so, I guess a couple different questions for you around that. It's like, first, years ago, you needed, if you had a flight department, you needed a scheduler, a dispatcher in the office. Like a lot of operations had them 24/7, like ready to go. That's really changed, especially over the last 2 years. How do you plug into that? And regarding like technology and availability and, how does that impact your business, and how do you see that, how do you see that changing in the industry?
So if for YonderWest purposes, it actually works out better than it did before. And a vast majority of that is because a lot of times the scheduler was kind of just somebody that you chained to a desk in a hangar. Mm-hmm. And with the pandemic, a lot of people just closed down their hangars. They said, we don't need this space, or even if we need the space, you don't have to be here. Why would you drive?
Right.
Why would you drive half an hour into an empty office just to go to work? So you're doing it from you're doing it from a home office, or you're doing it from a different desk in a corporate headquarters somewhere, but you don't have to go to the hangar anymore. And at the beginning of the pandemic, I had to have a serious consideration. I knew that my model was eventually going to prevail. I don't do short-term gains. I play a longer game, and quite frankly, the more and more people recognized pretty quickly that they didn't need to have their scheduler in the hangar anymore, which was great news for me, because in a world where people considered remote work an outlier, all of a sudden it became right front and center as this is the new standard.
Right.
So again, it makes no difference whether I'm sitting here with you in Fort Myers, or if I'm at home in Point Roberts, or if I'm, at a house in California or New Hampshire with my parents, or wherever I happen to be, because this service is exactly the same. So it's the same thing for a current corporate dispatcher who may have a hangar in Denver, but they're living out of a house in Fort Collins. They don't have to drive to the office every single day.
Sure.
So it's allowing. So thankfully for my benefit, it's allowed more flight departments to consider having outside help that they don't necessarily have to look over their shoulder with, because they're not doing that to their employees now.
Sure. Yeah. And it's creating a kind of a second layer of redundancy in that, like for a lot of flight departments, if you have one or two aircraft, these smaller flight departments, maybe you do have a full-time scheduler dispatcher, but the amount of time, relying on them, one person, 24 hours a day, puts a lot of stress on an individual.
Sure.
Having, outside help that could come in and supplement that, I would see that being pretty huge for these flight departments.
Yeah, and that's something that and it's kind of another reason I'm here, right? I'm trying to educate flight departments that there is that opportunity for them out there. Case in point, I've talked to a lot of flight departments that are like, oh, well, we'll never let an outsider in. But then they have their scheduler get overworked and leave, and they're like, well, what do we do now? We didn't have a succession plan. Yeah. And the answer is that for all the services we provide, for total airframe strategy, looking at what's 5 years down the road, everything that Greg does for me. At the end of the day, we are a retention company, right? So helping relief, make sure that people have less workload, that they have more day-to-day balance, that they have a work-life balance, that they can be present for their families, that they can, they don't have to fully focus on work all the damn time. Yeah. That's super important. And as a result of that, it's good for me, because more and more flight departments that recognize that their own people are super, super important. If you don't have a scheduler and you're putting all of the responsibilities that you would normally put on a scheduler onto a chief pilot or onto admin or yeah. And a lot of times, especially if you don't have a scheduler, you typically don't even have that additional administrative resources. So I know of I built an international program a couple of years ago for a group that pre-pandemic they did about 90% of their flying domestic on pretty large Gulfstream jets. But then they would have one random trip a year or two random trips a year where they would go from Vancouver to China, and then on to Johannesburg, and then over to Sydney, and then back to Singapore, and then to New Delhi, and then to London and Frankfurt, and back to London, and before they went to New York, and then Malibu, and then went home again. And that one trip, even though it may only have been 5-10% of their flying for the year, because they have 3 airplanes and they're doing a ton of domestic flying too. Right. It took away 35% of their workload, right? So all of a sudden, it was like, yeah, their pilots don't want to just go down to LA all the time, because it's anybody can do it. Sure. But at the same time, once you're that pilot that gets assigned to that Singapore trip, all of a sudden your workload just explodes. Sure. And having that additional resource is super beneficial. I don't necessarily do a lot of the international trip support myself. I vendor it out. And most of it is just simply as a business person, I don't really like that risk profile. But that being said, as a project manager, they get exactly the same services that they would, only they have a lot less. They don't have to stay on that vendor all the time.
Right.
They have me to kind of do that for them.
Right.
So they get a lot more flexibility. And at the end of the day, it's like if that becomes an ongoing thing, people may look forward to that Singapore trip, but they're also dreading the Singapore trip, right? So I don't want to do that. So instead, by having a contract dispatcher or a contract scheduler to be able to guide them in that process and provide one solid packet for them to do all their international with, then that allows them to get more flexibility. And ultimately, those pilots are going to stay longer because they have less responsibilities. They can focus on what they're trained to do and what they're really good at, which is flying the plane, right? So, because a lot of, pilots are pilots, right? They're always going to try to figure out a way to do it the easiest way possible while still maintaining, consistency and operational readiness.
Sure.
But the flip side of that discussion is that just because you're doing it the fast, dirty way doesn't necessarily mean that it's always the best way.
Yeah, sure.
So in reality, I mean, YonderWest is kind of it's kind of like an inexpensive middleman to help flight departments achieve their most ambitious missions while making it look like it's the Van Nuys to Teterboro milk run.
Right. Sure. Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah.
And so, looking at we had talked a little bit about the aircraft management side of things, and I've been talking with a lot of people, and there's been a lot of talk about, and you see it, on the news about consolidation, and these management companies are getting bigger and bigger. And I know that you have some thoughts about aircraft management, and so looking at down the road for YonderWest, how do you guys look at aircraft management, and what do you look what would you say some of the differences are in the way that you look at it versus maybe some of the companies that have been in this space for a long time?
So YonderWest, to a certain extent, is almost like an aircraft management-like company, right? So, I mean, at the end of the day, sure, an aircraft management company is expected to generally provide aircraft owners maintenance oversight, fuel, logistics, pilots, insurance, all the stuff that comes together that, most companies will put on a brochure and make it seem like it's an exclusive offering when them and every single one of their competitors do it. Because really the process for sales for aircraft management haven't changed in 35 years. They haven't had to.
Right.
And the entire argument that, we can get you preferential fuel prices. Yeah. That idea got jettisoned when fuel was $1.95 a gallon. And guess what? That was 2004.
Right.
Right? Like, here we are 16 years later and nothing has changed. You're using the exact same pitch to an aircraft owner to convince them that you can do something that, quite frankly, you're not very good at following through on the promises you made. Because the grass isn't, people will be like, I don't like this. I'm going to go try it somewhere else. Yeah, but the grass isn't greener on the other side of the airfield. It's just the exact same grass.
Right.
And so, and it kind of harkens back a little bit to the box discussion, because in reality, I mean, when you're an aircraft management company and all of a sudden there's a last minute trip and things need to go, who's the first person you call? Typically not the pilots. Call the scheduler. But that scheduler at an aircraft management company might have 10, 15, 20 other airplanes. Maybe they're working an overnight shift and they have the entire fleet.
Right.
And all of a sudden, spooling that up becomes a little much. And success isn't guaranteed.
Sure. Sure.
So in reality, by creating a more dedicated set of services, YonderWest actually is able to provide a more clean existence for aircraft owners. Whether they use an aircraft management company or not is really irrelevant at the end of the day, because you can run an individually siloed flight department and have that exact same relationships with your employees that you would by having a direct relationship with YonderWest and still having your aircraft with a large aircraft management company. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, it kind of harkens back to the old political ads, right? Like, who do you really want picking up the phone at 3 o'clock in the morning?
Sure.
You want someone you can trust.
Yeah.
And my experience at aircraft management, and bear in mind, it is in no way indicative of every single aircraft management company out there, because I'm sure that there's going to be some CEOs that listen to this and they say, what the hell is he talking about? But the fact of the matter is that it's not really slander if it's true. So, the being able to have that person you can trust, even having, a group like YonderWest as a middleman in between there, being like, hey, listen, I'm trying to guide an aircraft owner and this trip into making sure that it's set up for success as much as humanly possible, right?
Sure.
All the other things that might come into play, weather, COVID restrictions, international customs, fuel availability, crew availability, maintenance, all that other stuff, that's going to happen whether I'm involved or not, right?
Sure.
But at the end of the day, what I can control and what ultimately the aircraft owners want to be able to put that phone down after that 3 a.m. call and feel better about it until 7 a.m. when they get their coffee, right?
Yeah, sure.
They don't want to have to be agonizing over it, because half the time that's what happens. You call up a big aircraft management company and they say, oh, well, yeah, we can try to do that, and yeah, everything will be fine. But at the end of the night, your reptilian brain is like, I'm not super confident about that conversation.
Yeah.
So at least, having a dedicated person, having a dedicated guide for that aircraft journey is super important. And, I'm sure that there will be people who will say, oh, yeah, but we do that all the time. It's not a big deal. Yeah, but what you're forgetting is that aircraft manager, even if you have a dedicated point of contact, if you're at a large aircraft management company, that person is administering 15, 20 airplanes. You're one of many.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
It's not about it because it's ultimately not about what you want, because aircraft management companies have no problem taking 3 different Gulfstream 5s from competing companies and keeping them completely siloed from each other, and making sure that you're hiding one person's departure around the other side of the hangar so that the guy on the other side doesn't know you're leaving. But they have no problem with that. Mm-hmm. Whereas with me, I can be picky and choosy on what aircraft I handle and what companies I deal with and what clients I take, expressly for that reason, right? And because of that, the way that the aircraft management industry kind of looks at a lot of these things is that it's kind of like a grandfather kind of thing going on. It's like, oh, well, we have an insurance guy. We have someone that does the fuel. We have someone that does this. We have all these relationships, right? And if you go to the big MBAA conferences and trade shows, and everybody's like slapping each other on the back, and they're like, "Oh, everything's great." The fact of the matter is that they're all vying for that piece of that pie when they don't really know what's going on the inside. The difference is that, and I believe it's a benefit to aircraft owners, is that YonderWest is completely agnostic, right? So I can have individual aircraft using exactly the same services from different companies, and it has absolutely nothing to do with who I like and who I don't like. It's what is best for the individual aircraft owner. Mm-hmm. I can recommend my insurance guy in Sausalito, but I can also recommend an insurance person in Florida. I can recommend an insurance person in New Hampshire. I can recommend in half a dozen tax-free jurisdictions.
Sure.
But ultimately, all that matters is whether the aircraft owner is getting exactly what they want.
Mm-hmm.
So being agnostic in this sense is actually a benefit that, unfortunately, because of the way that aircraft management has decided to arrange itself, they've built up that box, and that box includes all of those people and all of those services. They may have great pricing, right? But I can get great pricing too.
Sure.
And at the end of the day, the way that people have to kind of look at it is that I believe that the agnostic view and being able to bring in people and bring in a contract director of maintenance and bring in a contract pilot and bring in, and even if that eventually becomes a full-time kind of thing for them, bringing in these people and having this big network of folks that are just standing by to assist, I think that's the future of Part 91 aviation. Mm-hmm. I don't believe that that aircraft management is the future. I think that, yes, you're right. There's going to be a lot of consolidation, and a lot of it is going to be supremely messy.
Mm-hmm.
and it's going to not be great business. I know in the last 2 years, some of the people that I admire most in aircraft management aren't at their aircraft management company anymore. And it's just simply because the way that the business is run is meant that they're cannon fodder.
Mm-hmm.
Like I know people that I'm like, I can't imagine them, like, of all the people to let go, why would you let this person go?
Mm-hmm.
This is your biggest asset. And they're completely oblivious to it because they've already predefined their box. And I want to be in a position to support my fellow schedulers and dispatchers, and aircraft sales folks and charter people. But at the end of the day, the fact that the charter groups are all blowing up, they have tons of business. Their leads are massive. At the end of the day, it's the other side of that coin that's really that's there detrimentally, right? So if you have an aircraft that's operated Part 91, you have no interest in charter, and you're an aircraft management company, you're normally the last priority. And all the marketing in the world isn't going to correct the fact that if you have an active trip and you're making revenue on charter and you're promising an aircraft owner charter revenue from it, that is going to be your first priority if you're an aircraft management company. The Part 91 trips, maybe they're few and far between, maybe they're super, super active, but at the end of the day, they still take a back seat. And I believe that the more and more people that unfortunately get burned in aircraft management, and especially in charter arrangements, red wine splashing all up on I believe that the more and more people that recognize the frailty in that, the more and more they'll realize that a non-denominational, completely service agnostic direction of creating independently siloed flight departments and then administering them is the future. Mm-hmm. I don't believe that there's, and don't get me wrong, there's been some great advancements in aircraft management, having set aside accounts for payments and not commingled funds and all this stuff. But really, that's a marketing ploy, right? Mm-hmm. Like that's the way it should be in the first
from
place.
The get-go. Yeah.
So really, what are we doing? We're making it seem as if there's some sort of special exclusion to what one company is doing over another. It's the exact same thing. I mean, my business partner in Los Angeles, Greg, he wrote half of the aircraft management arrangements and marketing in Southern California for the better part of a decade. And to this day, 2021, 2022, we will still see press releases and marketing pieces come out of the Southern California aircraft management companies that I can personally identify which lines were written by Greg Andrews in 1999 because it literally hasn't had to change.
Yeah.
Because the way they're selling it is exactly the same as it always has been. They're going after and they're saying, oh, well, there's, you're getting huge efficiencies of scale. You're getting all this pilot training. You're getting, who has operation control of the airplane, all this stuff. LinkedIn aside, every time I see an aircraft management company saying, our G650 is available for charter, it's not yours. Mm-hmm. And if you consider it yours, that's part of the problem right there. Because you are a fiduciary. You have a responsibility to that aircraft owner. You have a responsibility to that client. You have a responsibility to the safe operation of that aircraft. Because at the end of the day, we're burning dead dinosaurs, right? It's not about the looks. I mean, the average American consumer of private aviation products, when they think of business aviation, they think of two things. They think of Kim Kardashian on the cover of Vogue, and they think of the executives from Detroit showing up to Washington, D.C. asking for bailouts back in 2008, on the back of their Falcon. Like that's what they think of. When they look across the runway and they see a bunch of white tails next to a nondescript hangar, they think it's a bunch of Southwest airplanes that haven't been pulled around to the gate yet. Like there's just no comprehension that to the average American consumer, the business aviation is an industry rather than just an anomaly. Mm-hmm. And because of that, the aircraft management companies have been able to semi-capitalize on that, right? You deliberately try to make sure that your logo is in the shot when the paparazzi are taking photos of Brad Pitt getting off an airplane.
Sure.
Right. And there's I'm sure that there is value in that, but at the same time, it's like that's not really what we're about, right? If you're doing it for your own publicity, or hiring someone to take beautiful photos of your plane and then calling it your plane and then have it leave a month later, because that certainly happened, right?
Sure.
People certificate hop, and all of a sudden they it's like, oh well, this is my plane, but I'm going to give it to you, and then I'm going to give it to you, and I'm going to give it to you, and then all of a sudden a year and a half has gone by, and what have you got out of it? You just lost $250,000 each time you switch certificates because you didn't do enough due diligence in the first place to make sure that you did it right. And that's exactly why an independent set of advisors is better
Sure.
than the standard aircraft management thing. Because if you walk up and ask for a proposal from any of the, and Southern California is not an exception to any kind of rule. South Florida, New York, Dallas, Houston, it's all the same kind of thing. They come to you come to them and you say, okay, well, I have a Gulfstream 4. Can you manage this for me? And they say, okay, yeah, we can provide all of these services. And then they're just crossing their fingers to hope that you take them up on a bunch of them. And, for consolidation too, right now the big thing, and I don't think that consolidation management is really at any kind of apex. I don't think it's going to happen for the next 9 months or so probably before they're really ready to just buckle in.
Yeah.
Right now it's FBOs, right? Right now it's FBO chains, smaller chains buying bigger ones, individual groups buying up smaller groups, that kind of thing. But think about the life cycle of most FBOs these days too, right? When they first started and fuel had great margins, they could make an entire business on just fuel sales.
Right.
And then they say, oh, well, this isn't enough. We need to also do aircraft maintenance. Well, if we do aircraft maintenance, we should also be operating airplanes. So we should have a management certificate. We should do charter, because then we're going to have guaranteed people flying in and out. We can sell fuel to those people. And then, oh, well, now that we have maintenance, fuel, and FBO, we have, why don't we also venture out into other spaces? Because at the end of the day, they've had to diversify to live. And vice versa. If you're an aircraft management company, all of a sudden you realize, well, I'm not doing too well. I'm not really providing the promises I've told my aircraft owners I can do. So maybe we should, instead of just operating out of a hangar, maybe we should buy an FBO, have that dedicated fuel system, sell it to other people. And all of a sudden, you're diversifying out to the point where you're a jack of all trades, but you're a master in none of them.
Right.
Right. So I believe that, in 5-10 years, maybe YonderWest will become a true Part 91 aircraft management company. And maybe it won't be under the YonderWest name. Maybe, I'll be partnering with half a dozen people I know in the space that also believe that they can do it better than the current establishment.
Sure.
And that's a part of it. But it really, when you really look down to the brass tacks, is that diversification really something that is sustainable? And I think that pre-pandemic, you could make the argument that, we can make it work. But now?
Yeah. Well, I think in general, a lot of industries, whether it's, aviation or others, there tends to be these, cycles that everything goes through, right? And so, it becomes a point where there's consolidation, and that has its benefits, but then there's a hunger for
until the big boys collapse under their own weight, which we've seen multiple times.
Yeah, exactly. And then newcomers come to the plate. They offer more specialized service or more unique service, or maybe there's, better technology involved, or whatever it may be. And so to me, I know there's a lot of people saying like, oh, we're going to see this big consolidation, but I do see that, just like you said, if I really have a true need for a corporate flight department, do I want my aircraft in the hands of a company, or do I want my aircraft being in charter or whatever? And so I believe there's just going to be a flow in which this goes in. One of the big things that I think everybody is seeing is that as this demand has increased for charter, and as these companies are the management and charter companies are getting bigger, there is a shortage on labor. And it's not just pilots, it's maintenance, it's schedulers, it's dispatchers. The FBOs have a shortage, and they don't have enough people out on the line to be able to take care of these aircraft. And so from you being a scheduler, a dispatcher, how do you see that particular role and the people like coming into this industry? Do you see a shortage there? What do you think needs to happen in order to make sure that we have enough people that are trained and familiar with this particular capability?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that the flashy discussion on staffing is, of course, still pilots and maintenance techs.
Sure.
I talked to a lot of student pilots, and they recognize that I'm not, per se their perfect fit when it comes to, flow charts to an airline or try to get a first officer position on Pilatus. But that being said, for most of them, they say, well, what do you think I should do? I'm like, well, if you can get your A&P, you should go do it right now. If you can't do it right now, you should have gone back in time and did it yesterday. But the flashy part of it is pilots, of course, right? If you're flying a Falcon 7X and you're making $175,000 to $225,000 a year, and then you decide this isn't for you, and you decide to leave and go work for someone else, that's a huge staffing hit, right? And it's not just about the amount of people out there that are available to work. It's about being better and keeping people longer term, which is, of course, part of my mantra.
Yeah.
Specifically when it relates to schedulers and dispatchers, I think that work-life balance is exciting if you're young, and as you progress, you get better at it, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's better all the time. There's been a big push with a lot of the institutional players to make sure that people have access to new jobs in business aviation. I mean, if you want to go work for a big brokerage company, or if you want to work for an operator that's and you're scheduling out of a penthouse in Manhattan, great. All the more power. But the fact of the matter is, it's not enough to just get people in the door. It's not just about welcoming and making sure that those anonymous white tails on the other side of the airfield are a viable job option for people. But we also have to be better employers. We have to be able to I'm solidly a millennial, right? Like, doing job applications on TikTok or something, like, it's just not, like, I don't understand it. But at the same time, I've seen people that I know have exceptional talent, and they've completely flamed out. And it's because we as an industry aren't really that great at keeping people and and sustaining them and making sure that they have a longer term future, because a lot of times, and aircraft management is absolutely guilty of this, it's a little bit of a meat grinder sometimes, right? You come in, you're all excited, you get trained up, and then after a while you just kind of burn yourself out. And I've been on that side of the discussion many times.
Yeah.
I mean, at Satcom, we had 3 airplanes at the time, and we were doing 1,300 hours a year on 3 airplanes, and I was doing it alone. And I remember sitting down with, now she's retired, but I was sitting down with a very senior scheduler at one of the S&D conferences, and I whipped out my iPad and I showed her our calendar, and she was like, Neil, you don't realize you're not a small flight department, you're a big flight department. You just don't know it yet. And what I didn't realize, and I had at the time I was renting a house in Melbourne, and one of my coworkers, not in aviation but in the company, lived with me, and I would wake up at 5:00 in the morning and start returning emails, and he would wake up at 7, take a shower, and go to the office, and he'd be like, "Are you coming with me?" And I'm like, "No, I'm gonna take a nap for 20 minutes, and then I have to respond to more emails, and then I'm going to the hangar." Yeah. And he was like, I know you want to. And, but, at the end of the day, like, we have to be better about that. And I personally find the value in my company to both try to enforce change in the current organizational structures and in the current institutions that are running a vast majority of business aviation. But at the same time, give those institutions the ability to do that offloading, to be able to be a better employer to their people, to be able to retain people better, to be able to make sure that the pilots out there aren't worrying about, what Marriott they're going to stay at when they get to Teterboro, and more focused on what's going on in the airplane.
Sure.
And if you have blazing fast Wi-Fi and you're watching a movie, that's fine, because that's not, I want to make sure that they also can do that when they get to their final destination.
Yeah, sure.
And a lot of times, the airlines are always talking about, arrival within 14 minutes. And they're talking about very structured KPIs. And business aviation tries to, but because it's so dynamic, we kind of lose track of a lot of that sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, the KPIs are more about how are we measuring up and actually fulfilling our promises to aircraft owners.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of one of my big focuses, is that if we're going to be a better, in general, employer to people coming into business aviation, and we are sustaining them, and we are making sure that there is a progression and this is a career that they will stay in for 20, 30 years. Because let's be honest, I'm kind of loud and bombastic sometimes, but I'm 36 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't like my opinions now, buckle in, because you're going to have to put up with me for another 30 years, or until, let's count down to my heart attack, let's be honest. So, I mean, at the end of the day, I believe that I am on the right side of history. Mm-hmm. I think that eventually the curve of justice will bend to a more just and easily accessible Part 91 infrastructure for private aircraft owners. And it's going to be something that only expands, right? Eventually, the people that are currently all the way in, they've totally bought into charter, will eventually move into the fractionals. And when the fractionals aren't as competitive for them anymore, they'll move into maybe a partnership, right? Maybe they'll own half of an airplane instead of 1/8 of an airplane or 1/16 of an airplane. And eventually they'll have an airplane of their own. But if the only options available to them are to, if they're being, yelled down by aircraft management sales folks and saying, oh, it's too complicated, you can't do it alone, you're going to get yourself in trouble, you're too much risk, you got to come with us. Or they decide to do that and there isn't light at the end of that tunnel, and they throw up their hands and they say, well, what am I doing? How do I make this work? Mm-hmm. And the short answer is that there's more and more people like me out there that are agnostic operators. They're truly transparent when it comes to maintenance. They're, all the stuff that aircraft management has promised aircraft owners for years. There are groups of folks out there, great men and women, that will be able to create, provide, and sustain for Part 91 flight departments. Really, we can do it right now, but we can also do it for the next 20 years. Mm-hmm. And I think, I've seen the large aircraft management companies come in and say, hey, listen, we can operate a King Air just like we can operate a Falcon 7X. And sure, they're right, but they're only doing that because they feel that there's market pressure that, all of a sudden we're not being competitive in something. So we need to make sure that, we say that we can do something like that.
Right.
And at the end of the day, they're not really reinventing any kind of wheels. It's just another marketing ploy. Mm-hmm. If you're a large aircraft management company, you have 150 airplanes under management, do you really care about signing that King Air? The answer is you don't. Mm-hmm. Sure, you have a box for them. You've built a box. But at the end of the day, take it or leave it, right? Because if you don't do it, you're doing it at such low margin, because that same operator or that same aircraft owner has probably got 5 aircraft management proposals that they're evaluating. And by and large, they're probably not truly very different from each other than finance. And in addition to that, every single one of them has had a paragraph written by Greg Andrews sometime in the last 20 years. So, just remember, I am everywhere.
So looking at, I know the last couple of years, just with COVID and everything, has definitely been, for a lot of businesses, it's thrown off plans. But as you look at 2022, and continuing to grow your business. I know that, you said that you're big on like creating partnerships. How do you look at the next year, and what are you looking to accomplish, and how are you going to go about it?
So the pandemic has certainly changed the way I market and do sales. I'm overtly not a particularly strong salesperson. I'm an ops guy that, reluctantly kind of fell into this. But, I do have a set of standards where it's like, I want to make sure that, my logo is present. I believe that it's better to know me and not need me than to need me and not know me. Mm-hmm. So kind of being in that reptilian background of people's minds is more important than, going and knocking on doors every single day. So my marketing is evergreen. I've deliberately designed it so that, whatever an aircraft management company or a competitor throws at me, it's still valid, right? And then, in addition to that, I believe that, because I'm not going out knocking on those, I'm not going and knocking on those hangar doors, I'm going into that middle market, right? So I'm going in and I'm talking to the aircraft transaction attorneys and the insurance folks and the pilot staffing groups and my own contacts and networks, and being able to be a bigger part of that conversation. Because when someone is looking to either replace an aircraft or buy a new airplane, typically the ops side of that is the last thing, right? Because if you have an option between 5 aircraft management companies and they're all going to onboard you in exactly the same manner, and they're all going to do basically the exact same thing for you at the end of the day when you're operating the aircraft, then really, why are we, that's not the front of mind concern. That's not what people are thinking about. First of all, it's like, well, we can just figure that out down the road. Let's get the airplane. Let's, do what we have to do to make the money right, and then figure out how to operate it later. Because the one thing that aircraft management is pretty damn good at, unless you have to go through 135 conformity, which can kind of be a burden sometimes, really getting an aircraft up and running isn't really rocket science, and it doesn't take long. So, and that's one of the benefits, right? If you're an aircraft owner and you have a Challenger and you go to an aircraft management company, they say, oh yeah, we can get this, we can get you flying in a week or two. And that's great, right?
Yeah.
That's the timeline that works. For me, I play relatively risk adverse when it comes to strategy, and that's simply because I'm not a particularly great salesperson, right? I want to make sure that the climate is ready for services that I provide. So quite frankly, I don't really have a ton of plans for 2022 yet. I will say publicly on this podcast that I'm not going to any NBAA events next year.
Okay.
I'm not going to base. I'm not going to S&D in San Diego. I'm not going to leadership. Doesn't mean I won't fly in for an after party, but I'm not going to any of the events. And quite frankly, the rationale is that the ROI just isn't there for me. As a result, the last couple of years, I've had to run very lean. Because, again, I'm the last part of that discussion when it comes to aircraft operation. And if you're a Part 921 flight department, you're not back yet. Charter, fractional, blowing up, right?
Yeah.
Everybody's in the best time of their lives. But Part 91 is still very much based on consumer confidence. And consumer confidence is not back. So as such, I've kind of just kept this relatively low profile for exactly that reason. Because I don't want to be the loudest, brashest person on the block. I want to be the guy that you go to that gets shit done, and then you can go on with your life.
Sure.
So,
makes sense.
Yeah. But I mean, for partnerships, I believe that partnerships are super important, and whether that be part of that discussion with the middle market, with the insurance brokers, with the transaction folks, that's super important. But also being able to form partnerships with people that are very good at things that I am not. Right. I'm a halfway decent scheduler. Halfway decent business person, maybe, depending on who you ask. If you ask my mother, it's a bad idea. Yeah. But that being said, I'm not a maintenance person.
Right.
I'm not really a pilot. Like I can, figure out how to make all this stuff work for pilots, and I can, get scheduling systems up and running, and I can, help decipher, aircraft management arrangements, and I can help with with the different in-flight connectivity providers and figure out exactly what the best use case is for individual flight departments. But at the end of the day, I'm reliant on folks that are better than me at a lot of other things.
Sure.
So whether that be, like Craig Pickens is a great example, right? Craig's probably one of the best in the business when it comes to executive recruiting.
Mm-hmm.
And he and I have spoken from time to time. We don't do a lot of business together, but that being said, he's very successful at something that I'm not good at all.
Right.
Right. So it's being able to form those partnerships. And as we see consolidation in the industry, I mean, there's going to be some pretty splashy headlines, I would guess, over the next 6 months, for better or for worse.
Yeah, sure.
Worse for some people, better for others. And as a result of that, people a lot of times don't come to me when everything's going good. They come to me when there's a crisis.
Right.
And I mean, I would hope that they would come to me before that crisis really becomes a problem. But, being able to have that self-actualization is part of the issue, right? If you're an aircraft management company, everything's good all the time because you want to save face in front of your clients. But then when things fall apart, you're deliberately looking for someone to blame.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had job interviews where people have been like, are you a phone call or an email kind of person? I'm like, I'm a phone call person. Because you and I having a conversation right now, different cadence, we can communicate more directly. You can understand and infer from my tone of voice, all this stuff, right? But the way that they looked at it, and they were like, that's not really how we do it. We want it on email. Well, they want it on email because they want to be able to look back and blame someone if someone put a punctuation mark in a wrong place. And it's like, that's not really, passing the buck isn't what gets this done, right? And it's super easy to just, blame the management company or blame this guy or blame that guy or be like, oh, the fuel truck was late or, whatever the case may be, right? But at the end of the day, none of that ultimately matters. I mean, you can have a perfectly great 20-hour trip in a large Gulfstream and then, wait for customs in Teterboro for 20 minutes, and that ruins the entire trip like a heartbeat. And there's nothing that you or I or the operator or the pilots can do about that. It's just the way it is. Now, we can try to mitigate that, but at the end of the day, if it's a matter of an aircraft management company, scrolling through their emails and furiously trying to figure out who messed up, it's like, what are we doing?
Yeah.
Like, that harkens and circles back to the entire being a better employer, right? Because you don't want to put that pressure on someone who, your priority is keeping that $200,000 pilot on a G5, but are you really going to, run a scheduler that's making $65,000 a year through the meat grinder simply because customs in Teterboro didn't show up fast enough because there was a line of 20 Learjets ahead of them? Like, what are we doing?
Yeah, sure.
We have to be better. We have to be better employers. We have to be better people. We have to be able to, be honest, right? Like, just covering it up or at the very least, trying to ascertain who messed up where, that doesn't really help us at the end of the day. I mean, I've worked for companies where every time a problem happens, they put together a new spreadsheet so that they can quantify it. And then all of a sudden, a 3-step process becomes a 20-step process because that one trip didn't go well, all of a sudden you have an entire another checklist to run, right? It's like, but that's how they look at it because they have to be accountable to their owners. Whereas instead of just, telling them straight up, hey, this is what happened. This is what we're doing to correct it. But trusting that their people, whether that be a pilot or a maintenance tech or a scheduler or an admin or an accountant who's filing who's sending that bill over to the owner, whatever process was the problem, we need to stop blaming each other internally to try to save face. We need to just be real with them.
Yeah.
And part of the problem is that a lot of these aircraft managers and a lot of the aircraft management companies, they're scared of their owners, right? Because if you're unhappy right here, you can go across the field to a different aircraft management company and get the exact same service.
Sure.
All it's going to take is time, money, and a little bit of heartache.
Yeah, sure. And I like your going back just a little bit regarding like partnerships and creating, really like a network of people. And like you said, you're not an expert in maintenance. You're not a pilot. And so I think that's really valuable advice for people that are coming up in the industry. And, everybody tends to have their kind of specialty or what they're most familiar with. But really like branching out and understanding some of the different aspects of the business and getting familiar with the different service providers or the different technology or the different players, or just, getting kind of like building this network is I think is really valuable for people that are coming up through the industry. And especially, working as like if you're in a corporate flight department, the amount of value that you can provide by understanding like the full environment of the business, not just like the scheduling aspect of things or just flying the plane or whatever it may be. I think that's huge. And the people that I'm seeing really be successful in their roles are really, relying on this network of people around them to help kind of fill the gaps that they have in their experience, and has been big for them. But
and more than that, it's about identifying exactly what those limitations are.
Sure.
Right? Because it's Monday. So last week I was in Seattle and I did a G550 evacuation door training with Air Care, and people were asking me there, and they're like, "Well, do you want to become a corporate flight attendant?" My answer is no. I just want to be more useful. And if that means, and realistically, I mean, my goal, other than expanding the company and being able to, make sure that we can provide more services to more people on a more transparent basis. I mean, my ideal job is to, be thrown into crew rest, and on that 10-hour flight to London, if all of a sudden we decide, oh, well, we need to go to Frankfurt instead, or after London we're going to go to Tel Aviv instead of Istanbul, all of a sudden I'm just sitting here with my laptop and type in crew rest, and I make all of it happen, and all it costs them, because I'm on retainer, all it costs them is an extra night in a hotel, right?
Sure.
So because of that, it's I hate to say it's like a life hack, but it's an easy way to become a crew member on board an aircraft and be able to provide services, even if that's not the, delineating line. Just,
sure.
Quite frankly, I mean, sure, I know a little bit about wine because I've worked in the wine industry a little bit, but I'm probably a pretty terrible corporate flight attendant. And the nice thing is that I recognize that. So...
Well, cool. Well, I appreciate you, coming through and having this conversation. It's good to get some insights into, some of the things that you're thinking about and some of the kind of long-term changes that you're thinking about for the industry. Is there anybody that you want to give a shout out to?
I've been listening. I kind of half jokingly style myself as a tech entrepreneur. The vest and all the stuff,
plaid and
yeah. Got the plaid. I mean, you can't tell I'm wearing No, I'm kidding. I'm not wearing sweatpants. But I've been listening to a lot of podcasts by Kara Swisher, and I think that she's absolutely incredible. And if anybody wants to be able to get a better understanding of global finance and tech, especially as it, in the grand scheme of looking at everything from social networking to the metaverse to the billionaire space race, I think that she's absolutely brilliant. And more than that, I think that one thing that I have a lot of friends that I could name a bunch of them, but it's not really my style. I will say that, for all my browbeating and punching aircraft management companies from time to time, I do have a few favorites.
Okay.
I do think that there's a bunch of people that are doing it incredibly well. I think that Grandview Aviation is doing exceptional things. Just recently, Jesse, had announced a reduction in daily flight hours for crews, which is huge because it's super difficult it's really easy to put in a press release. It's difficult to do in actuality. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's actually like a concrete step. Summit Aviation up in Montana is doing an amazing job. I think that there's a bunch of aircraft management companies out there. CB SkyShare out in California and Utah is doing an amazing job. I really am a big fan of the I mean, I do like the Pilatus platforms personally, but I think that there's a lot of usability cases in people using aircraft for kind of like the shorter hops than being able to have that extra long leg. So like a PC-24 and a PC-12 combination is a great combination for a lot of these companies, right? But the flip side of it is that I believe that private aviation is taking off out of Reno and landing in your private ranch in Oregon and being able to go and hang out for the weekend and then come back, because that's what they've paid for, right? If you just have a G4 that's going to run from Opa-locka to White Plains to Van Nuys to back to Opa-locka and just do that triangle in reverse, you do that on American Airlines. You don't need a private airplane for that. It just makes you feel a lot better doing it. So I believe that there are better use cases. But I also believe that the more charter companies, management companies that are specializing in more utilitarian uses of private aircraft are really the future. And I want to be able to be in a position to not only focus on the Part 91 companies, but at the same time being able to give credit where credit is due. And I think that that's really important. I think that a lot of times, everybody passes each other on the back in Vegas and Orlando, and then we go home and stab each other in the backs. And I think that we should be giving credit where credit is due.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, that's awesome. Some good name drops there. I appreciate you coming out and sitting down and chatting, and it was good seeing you.
Yeah, you too.
And we'll do it again.
Absolutely.
All right.
Looking forward to it.
Sounds good. Thanks.